morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me, really a privilege to be with you guys again. It was 1905 when he was born. He was born to a Jewish family from Austria. And the First World War was very devastating on his family. He was the middle child, and they had to walk with his siblings through farms to be able to find food. However, as the war ended, when he started high school, he showed to have a lot of promise. He actually published his first scientific paper while he was still in high school, a paper based on psychology. He went to medical school, and while he was in medical school, he provided mental health care for teens that were suicidal and for women. And after he finished medical school, he opened a private practice. And you can say that life was starting to look up for Viktor Frankl. Life was good. However, the annexation of Austria to Nazi Germany changed things drastically for him. He was a doctor, so he had an option. He could apply for the lottery visa to come to the US. And because he was a trained physician, he was granted a visa. The only issue was that he was the only one in his family who had been granted a visa. So if he decided to leave, he had to leave his two siblings and his parents behind. And Viktor did not know what to do. So what he decided to do is to look to a higher power and to ask God, what should I do? And the answer came in a very, very peculiar way. The Nazis had been destroying synagogues around all Austria, and his dad had picked up some of the rubble that had been found in the synagogues. And while he was looking at this piece of rubble, it was a very particular one because it was where the 10 Commandments were in the synagogue. And it was actually the 5th commandment that said, honor your father and your mother. And that's all that Viktor needed to know. He decided to stay in Austria and go with the fate along with his family. Viktor got married in 1942 to a beautiful woman named Tilly. And only a few months later, his wife and all his family got rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. His dad didn't survive. He died of pneumonia and of hunger. Then they announced that it was their turn to be moved to Auschwitz. And it was only his family, not his wife. But his wife loved him so much that she volunteered to go with them. Sadly, she was separated later on and sent to another concentration camp where she perished. Viktor didn't know this until he was liberated in 1945. Sadly, he was the only one of his family who had survived. His mother and his brother died in the gas chambers. And when he was liberated in 1945, and years later after getting his PhD in psychology, he wrote a book. Maybe you have heard about it. Man's Pursuit, or sorry, I forgot. Not Man's Search for Meaning. Yes, sorry. And in this book, he said something that really stood out for me. It says, we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. How can you find the strength to give other people your last piece of bread? It says that Viktor Frankl, even though he was in that terrible situation, he actually helped other people that had been arriving to the camps to provide them mental health care. for people that were suicidal, for people who were depressed. How can they not be depressed? How can you find the strength to be able to see the goodness in life in such terrible circumstances? And you know, this is not a question that only we have today. It is a question that the people of Israel also had to confront. They had just left captivity because they had not been listening to God's word. They had not been following his commandments. They had been taken to captivity by the Babylonians, and then the Medes and the Persians. And now they were finally allowed to go back to Jerusalem. But the Jerusalem that they were going back to, it wasn't the Jerusalem that they had left. It was in complete ruins. The temple had been completely destroyed. And the people had to confront something that was even bigger. They did not remember the law of God. They had forgotten who they really were. And Nehemiah and Ezra, knowing this and knowing that if the people did not remember the law of God, this thing that they had just survived, the captivity by Babylon and by the Medes and the Persians, it was going to happen again. So what they decided to do, before they can begin to reconstruct, before the people can start moving forward, they had to remind the people who they were. So they gathered everybody in the water gate, and there Ezra stood. And if we go to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, verses 5, we can see the story. Ezra opened the book. All the people could see him because he was standing above them. And as he opened it, the people all stood up. Ezra praised the Lord, the great God, and all the people lifted their hands and responded, Amen. And they bowed down and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. The problem is that the people from Israel were so lost. They had forgotten so much of who their God was that even though they were listening, the words that were coming or what Ezra was reading right out of the book, they could not understand what he was reading. And Ezra and Nehemiah and the other leaders knowing this, they had assigned certain Levites so they can go around with the people and explain what they were listening. And the people of Israel understood. They understood so well that when they finally heard the words of the law in language that they could understand, they were sad. They cried. But Ezra and Nehemiah, in this case Ezra, asked them to do something very interesting. And this is in verse 10. Nehemiah said, Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks, and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to our Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Now, there are many interpretations of what we can see, what we can think about what is the joy of the Lord. And I know that many sermons have been preached. But really, when I read this, I was curious. The people of Israel were sad. How can you send them to eat and drink and say the joy of the Lord is your strength? And then it made me think, could the people of Israel go back to their history, go back to their prophets, go back to their kings, and find examples there in the Bible that could help them explain what does it mean to be or to have the joy of the Lord, and that be your strength? Because in reality, when we are being completely blessed by God, when everything is great in our life, It is easy to find strength and the joy in the will of God because everything is going perfect for us. But what do we do? How do we find strength in the will of God when everything that is happening to us is not of our choice? It's something that is completely unfair. And you know, the Bible never disappoints. When I opened the Bible and when I started reading, I went back to the time of the first 2 kings of Israel and found examples of how people were able to find the joy of the Lord or strength in the joy of the Lord in circumstances that were completely unfair. The first character that we're going to be talking about today is going to be in the time of David. We can find his story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verses 3 and beyond. So just so you can have a little bit of a conceptual context of what is happening here in 2 Samuel. David has just become king. It hasn't been that long. He was anointed, and there was still a lot of issues with the Philistines in this case still. Finally, David was able to conquer Jerusalem, and now that he had conquered Jerusalem, the first thing that he wanted to do is that he wanted to move the Ark of the Lord, which was the symbol of the presence of the Lord, and be able to take it in Jerusalem, where he wanted to build a temple to God. So he gathered all the people, he gathered Levites, he went to the house of the person that had the Ark of the Lord, and then what they did is that they put the Ark of the Lord in a carriage over ox, and then they moved it. Now, there's something that you have to remember about the story is that there was very specific rules that God said, and they said nobody was able to touch the Ark of the Lord, because what would happen? If anybody would touch the Ark of the Lord, they would die. So we're going to start reading the story. This is where we are at the story, and we're going to start reading in verse 3. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 3. They set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it to the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the Ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out, took hold of the Ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the Ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the Ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the Ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The Ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now, today we're not going to focus on David, and we're not going to focus on Uzzah. But we're going to focus on a character of the story that is all the way to the end, and that's Obed-Edom. And you might say, why are we going to focus on Obed-Edom, and how does this have to do anything with the joy of the Lord is my strength? The only thing that this character did was take the ark of the Lord and kept it in his house for 3 months. That's all he did. But I want you to hear what the spirit of prophecy has to say about this story. Because once we start really understanding what this means, we're going to see Obed-Edom in a completely different light. You have to understand, it is like somebody said, you're coming from a camp, they're putting something from the church in your car, and all of a sudden, or from somebody else's car, and all of a sudden, you're trying to keep this thing safe, right? It's from church. But somebody touched it, and that person died. This is what's happening. And the spirit of prophecy says something very interesting. It says that when Uzzah fell to the ground, it says, in King David, a sudden terror fell upon the rejoicing throng. David was astonished and greatly alarmed, and in his heart he questioned the justice of God. He had been seeking to honor the ark and the symbol of its divine presence. Feeling that it would be unsafe to have the ark near him, David determined to let it remain where it was. A place was found for it nearby in the house of Obed-Edom, to get tight. And you know, it really makes me think. Because if you were Obed-Edom and you just saw what had happened, that somebody had just struck down and had just died, and then the king, the anointed one, the one that God had picked to rule over Israel, not even him would touch the ark. He said he was so afraid that he said, I am not going to move the ark from here. I have to find a place where to leave it. Would you volunteer? Really, would you volunteer? Would you say, hey, sure, bring the ark here into my house. I don't know if I'm worthy. Obviously, this person that was a Levite who touched it wasn't worthy. He died. And you know, when I realized that Obed-Edom was a Gittite, I was like, did David did that on purpose? Because this guy was not even an Israelite. Was David said, you know what? If God is going to kill any other person, may it not be an Israelite. Let's go get a person that's a Philistine and put it in his house, because if the whole household is going to die, let it be from people that are not Israelites. But that's the situation which Obed-Edom is in. The king told him that he has to take the ark of the Lord into his house. And the spirit of prophecy says something very interesting about what the reaction of Obed-Edom. It says, feeling that his own heart was not wholly right with God, in this case David, seeing the stroke upon Uzzah, had feared the ark, lest some sin of his part should bring judgments upon him. But Obed-Edom, though he rejoiced with trembling, welcomed the sacred symbol as the pledge of God's favor to the obedient. The attention of all Israel was now directed to the Gittite and his household. All watched to see how it would fare for them. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. You can say that Obed-Edom was put in a terribly unfair situation. I wouldn't want something that could strut my whole family down to come into my house. But Obed-Edom understood that what? That the joy of the Lord, that the will of God was that he was to take the ark of the Lord into his house. And though he trembled, and though he wasn't sure, and though he said, God, this is unfair, because if something happens, if anybody in my family is not square with you, everybody might die. He said, he rejoiced. Trembling, he rejoiced and he allowed it in. He understood that the joy of the Lord was for the ark to be with him. And there he found the strength. And what did God do? He blessed them. He blessed all his household. And people were staring. They were. I imagine people, thinking like, oh, it's in. Is he dead? No. Next day, is everything okay? Yes, Edom is fine. And then they started to see that everything around Edom has started to get, blessed. And says that King David was watching what was happening in the household of Obed-Edom. And then after 3 months, on verse 12, it says, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. A completely unfair situation for Obed-Edom. However, he understood the joy of the Lord, and in there, he found strength. Now, Obed-Edom saw that once you understand the joy of the Lord, you can find strength there, and God would bless you greatly. He saw that almost right away. But what happens when you understand the joy of the Lord, but you don't get all the blessings that Obed-Edom had? How can you find strength in that situation? And when I was looking at the Bible, I was trying to think of different characters that I would see, they didn't have a fair chance. And one of the characters that popped into my mind was Jonathan. Now, we talked about Jonathan in my previous sermon, if anybody of you remember. But Jonathan is a very peculiar character to me. Jonathan, we're going to find his story throughout 1 Samuel. And to be very briefly, Jonathan is the firstborn of the first king of David. He's the firstborn of King Saul. Now, King Saul, at the beginning, when he was picked to be king, everybody wanted him in Israel. He went and liberated many towns. He was blessed by God. But through his actions, he had distanced himself from God, and God had decided that there was going to be another king. And it was not going to be Jonathan. It was going to be David. Samuel was sent to anoint David. The thing is that Saul was having, now that God had left Saul, he had been starting to have these issues with spirits tormenting him. And one of the things that David did very well was able to sing and play the harp and the lyre. So what they recommended to Saul is that he bring David and that he could play for him so the spirit can stop tormenting him. And this is how David and Jonathan, I assume, met. David was living with King Saul. David later goes. He is able to kill a giant, and he comes back to Saul. And then David is such a good warrior that he's sent out to the Philistines, and he does a lot of campaigns. And the people of Israel, especially the women, start singing a song saying, Saul has slain thousands, but David has slain 10,000s. And Saul did not like that. Saul did not like that. He started to feel threatened that his kingdom was being threatened by David. So from then on, he resolved that he was going to kill David any way he could. The problem that David had become very good friends, or best friends, with his son Jonathan, his firstborn. And in many times that Saul had been trying to kill David, David finally tells Jonathan, I'm not going to go to the feast that your dad has trying to prepare me because your dad is trying to kill me. And Jonathan's like, I don't think so. My dad tells me everything. I don't think my dad is trying to kill me, to kill you, Jonathan, David. But Saul is indeed trying to kill David in this occasion. And what is interesting from the character of Jonathan is that though his dad Saul had disobeyed the Lord, that was not the case with Jonathan. The Spirit of God was Jonathan. Jonathan had been able to go fight against the Philistine and bring down 20 people on his own, being able to lead the people of Israel all the way to drive out the Philistines. And even though his dad was very mad against David, he understood that David had done nothing wrong to deserve death. So even though his dad was a terrible person, Jonathan wasn't a terrible person. If he wasn't better than David, he was not worse than David. If God had chosen him to be the successor, I think he would have been a good king. However, that was not the will of the Lord. The joy of the Lord, the will of the Lord, was with David. That was what God had decided to do. And in this occasion, when Saul is trying to kill David and Jonathan protects him, Saul tells Jonathan this very bluntly. When he heard that that David was not coming to the banquet, it says that Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me. He must die." Why? Jonathan replies, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan then proceeds and tells David that he must escape. And if you really start to think about this story, is that Jonathan is in an unfair situation. Because if God had taken the kingdom away from Saul, it was because of Saul's actions. It wasn't because of Jonathan's actions. He was the rightful heir of the throne. He had done nothing wrong. He had not disobeyed God. And if you think in the successor in the story of kings in the Bible, you will see that there were terrible, terrible kings in Israel. There was Manasseh, who was a terrible king, and then still his son Amon became a king, and God allowed that to happen. Why would he not allow this to happen for Jonathan? Jonathan was treated unfairly. It wasn't his fault that he was not picked to be the successor king. But Jonathan had understand that the joy of the Lord was with David. And he really understood it because, again, David flees, and in a few chapters later, we're going to see in 1 Samuel 23, it says that David liberates a town from Israel, and then Saul is told that David is there, and he is going to try and kill him, and Jonathan is with his dad. And then he is able to find David. But what is interesting to me in this story is that David is starting to be scared. He's like, Saul is near me. I might die. I don't know. God picked me. But his strength is starting to flare. And it says that Jonathan finds him. And in verse 15 of chapter 23 of 1 Samuel, it says, "While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. 'Do not be afraid,' he said. 'My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be the king over Israel, and I will be a second to you. Even my father Saul knows this.'" Jonathan is saying, I have accepted the joy of the Lord. You are to be king. I know it. My dad knows it. It is an unfair situation to me. But that is the joy of the Lord. And in that, I have found my strength. And with that, I am also giving you strength, David, who has taken my place, because that is the joy of the Lord. And sadly, Jonathan never became the second to David. Because of Saul's bad decisions and taking Israel to a battle that they should not be in, at the end of the book, we see that Saul dies and all of his 3 sons die with him. Jonathan, that's the joy of the Lord? That you get your kingdom taken away, the rightful heir to the throne, and then you die in a battle that's not even your fault? That is the joy of the Lord for Jonathan. He never saw the blessings, ever saw the blessings. He never saw the blessings of the Lord like Obed-Edom did when he was able to see how God had blessed him. Jonathan didn't see any of those blessings, and still he had found strength in the joy of the Lord. Now, Jonathan never saw those blessings, but in chapters later, specifically in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, you can see that David never forgot what Jonathan had did for him, and he found his son and gave him back all the lands that Saul had lost, the lands that were rightfully his. But these 2 stories really remind us that sometimes the joy of the Lord is not necessarily the stuff or the decisions that we want to make. We can be like Obed-Edom. It could be like, God, this is scary. I might die if I do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to take this job. I don't want to stop doing this. I don't find that what you are asking me to do is going to be your joy. How can that be your joy? But God is asking us to be like, I know you cannot understand. I know that, that it doesn't seem that my will is fair to you. But if you are willing to rejoice in my will, to find joy, if you understand what my will is, I will give you strength for you to continue going. And sometimes it can be like Jonathan. We might not ever see the blessings, and we might not ever understand why is that this is the decision. It's an unfair situation. But if we trust in the joy of the Lord, God will always give us strength. I don't know what you're going through this week. I don't know what is going on in your life during, these times. But if you're ever wondering if God's will is not always the best thing for you, I want you to remind you that the joy of the Lord, that the will of God, as long as we follow it, is always the best for his children, and he will give you strength. May we always find strength in the joy of the Lord.